Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Exploring the Faith YouTube channel. Now, in today's video, we're going to talk about a rather brief topic. Well, as brief as a topic in theology can be. And today I'm going to talk about something that really gets under my skin. And it really concerns a larger issue when many otherwise seemingly intelligent people decide to completely disregard basic reading comprehension skills. And we're going to be talking about that one verse, which is probably one of the top 5 or top 10 best known Bible verses. And yet it's the one that causes so much annoyance for so many faithful Catholics and so many faithful Christians, because it's a verse that's really easy to understand, and yet it's so widely misinterpreted. And that is the verse from Matthew chapter 7, where Jesus says, "Don't judge, lest ye be judged." And so, without further ado, let's get into a sort of a quick but in depth analysis of this particular text. Now, the verse, "Don't judge, lest ye be judged," is actually taken from the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, verse 1. And for anyone who's even done a cursory reading of the New Testament, they'll know that Matthew chapters 5 through 7 are what is known as the Sermon on the Mount. And when you read the verse that says, "Don't judge," you'll see that the full quote is, "Don't judge that you may not be judged." Some particularly older translations may say, "Don't judge lest ye be judged," but it's essentially saying the same thing. But the thing is, a lot of people say this quote and then they just stop there, which is not a good way to interpret the Bible, mostly because in order to properly understand the meaning, you have to look at the immediate context, which means you have to look at the verses immediately before and immediately after it. And when a lot of people say, "Don't judge, lest ye be judged," well, what a lot of people interpret that as meaning is, don't judge in a self-righteous sort of way, or don't take part in rash judgments, all of which are true or good. Now, some people will very frequently quote this verse on controversial topics like gay marriage or abortion. Or whenever you point out the sins of another person, people will be very quick to state this verse, basically to say, only God can judge me, and I don't want to listen to your moral diatribe. The thing is, that's not what this verse is saying at all, because the teaching against judging, Jesus has several verses, in fact, 5 verses in Matthew chapter 7, in which he talks about the nature of judging and the sort of judging that he's condemning. You see, Jesus is not condemning the notion of passing judgment on others. In fact, the Bible is filled with moral and spiritual wisdom, which we are supposed to use to make moral judgments about ourselves and about others. But what Jesus is condemning is a specific type of judging. So let's look at the next few verses. So verse 1 says, "Stop judging that you may not be judged." And then he goes on to say, "For as you judge, so will you be judged. And the measure with which you measure will be measured out to you." So basically, Jesus is saying, if you judge others, the standard with which you judge others will be applied to you. But then verses 3 and 4 really get to the heart of what Jesus is trying to say. So in Matthew chapter 7, verse 3, he says, "Why do you notice the splinter in your brother's eye, but do not perceive the wooden beam in your own eye?" And then he goes on to say in verse 4, "How can you say to your brother, let me remove that splinter from your eye, while the wooden beam is in yours?" So basically, Jesus comes up with an analogy to describe what he's saying. And so imagine, that when people, when they work with wood, Sometimes little tiny bits of wood will fly off and land on your face or something. And imagine if two people are walking with wood and one of them has a little tiny splinter of wood that lands on his eye. But another person, so much wood has accumulated on their face that it looks like they have a beam of wood sticking out of their eye. So it's a rather extreme analogy, but that gets to the point that Jesus is trying to say. Imagine if someone who has a particularly bad problem is ignoring their own problems and looking at similar, though lesser problems in other people. That's what Jesus is talking about. Jesus is talking about the notion of people being basically lacking moral self-awareness. Coming up with a particular moral standard and then applying that standard to others, but not applying it to themselves. And that is actually what hypocrisy is. You see, traditionally, in the Catholic tradition and in the Christian tradition more generally, hypocrisy wasn't seen simply as the failure to practice what you preach. Rather, it's not even taking seriously what you preach to begin with. So as a result, when other people sin, you're all over their case, but you continually make excuses for yourself to sin. And Jesus goes on to say this in verse 5. He says, "You hypocrites, remove the wooden beam from your eye first, then you will see clearly to remove the splinter from your brother's eye." So Jesus isn't condemning the notion of judging, because even right here, Jesus is giving us a moral standard that judging, at least in certain contexts, is wrong. So if we see other people do that, wouldn't we say that it's wrong? Absolutely. So the thing is, Jesus is condemning hypocritical judging. So people who have issues, but they ignore their own issues, but are more than willing to point out those issues in other people. And what Jesus is saying is that we need to be consistent in our judgments. We need to first get our own house in order before we can judge others. Otherwise, if we have a particular moral standard, and this is a particularly sad situation if we have a moral standard rooted in the truth, but if we have a particular moral standard that we apply to everyone else but ourselves, wouldn't that imply that we don't really take our own moral standards that seriously? So that right there is hypocrisy. Imposing on other people moral standards that we ourselves don't believe. Now, the notion of not taking part in rash judgments or not taking part in self-righteous judgments, both of those things are bad, and they represent not so much sins, but dispositions that could potentially lead to sin. And that's why a lot of Christians rightfully speak out against it. But that's not the point that Jesus had in mind. Jesus was talking about, again, being consistent in our judgments, judging others and judging ourselves by the same standard. Though in reality, if we are consistent in our judgments, holding ourselves to the same standards that we hold other people, then ultimately that will lead us to not be rash in our judgments. It will lead us to not be self-righteous. And so basically the point is, it's clear what Jesus is trying to say when you look at like the 3 or 4 verses immediately following Matthew chapter 7, verse 1. So all I'm saying is before you quote a biblical verse, always read the context to make sure that you're getting it right. And again, thank you very much for joining me and have a great day.